I've been tracking a vintage portfolio of some of the most popular Wizards of the Coast cards in both PSA 9 and PSA 10 condition. Right now, you're looking at the top 20 performing cards in this portfolio over the last year and 3 months. Today, I wanted to break down the data and share with you, are vintage cards finally getting the respect that they deserve, or are they being overhyped and susceptible to a massive correction? That's what we're going to talk about in this video, so roll up your sleeves and let's dive into some data. I'm Pokemon Classics, let's roll the intro. Hey everybody, what's up from Pokemon Classics? Reminding you all that the classics never go out of style. Classics are the name of the game into today's video because we're going to be taking a look at a custom portfolio of vintage Wizards of the Coast cards and seeing how they've been performing in this recent market mania that we've all been experiencing. Now, in a previous video, I looked at these exact same cards and their year-to-year performance from January of 2024 to January of 2025. But now, we're going to take a look and see how they're doing in the first quarter of this year, here in 2025. A quick disclaimer, many of these cards have been exploding in price, and that's really true of the market as a whole. And so it begs the question of whether or not now is an adequate time to buy, or if there's a little bit of danger. It is looking a little bit frothy, a little bit bubbly out there, and I'll weigh in with my own personal opinion and perspective on where these price growth and price trends are heading. But anyway, let's dive into the data, starting with base set. We'll start with the PSA 9s, which you'll see represented on your screen in yellow on the left-hand side, and any of these numbers that are in green represent a price growth or appreciation. And some of the ones that I wanted to mention specifically here are the first edition PSA 9 Charizard from base set, and that one moved from $20,000 to $24,841, which is a pretty substantial growth. Now, another one on here that's worth mentioning is the Shadowless Blastoise, and previously this one was $1,287 back in January, and here in March, we've seen it grow to $1,599. Now, you'll also see that some of these prices have actually dropped since January, but overall, the total amount for all these cards went from $37,155 up to $41,815. So although that price increase isn't as rapid as it was on the year-on-year, going from January of 2024 to January 2025, it still represents about a $4,000 growth over just the last few months. Speaking of which, if we take a look at the PSA 10 prices, which are represented on the right-hand side of your screen in blue, we'll find that 3 of these cards haven't had a significant sale since January of 2025. Of the ones that did sell, 3 of them have increased in price and 3 of them have decreased in price. One of the ones that I wanted to draw attention to is the Shadowless Blastoise once more, and this one I have listed as a price decline, selling for $5,800, but there was actually just a sale yesterday on Fanatics for over $9,000, so that's a pretty big increase. One of the notable decreases, though, is the Unlimited Charizard, which has dropped by a couple $1,000s, going from January of 2025 to here in March. Overall, the prices for all these cards collectively has gone down from $351,518 down to $349,676. Looking at the cards from Jungle Set and Fossil Set, we'll see a similar trend. In the PSA 9 prices, pretty much all of them have increased at least a little bit, with the exception of the Snorlax, which has dropped from $887 down to $800. Otherwise, we've seen some notable price gains with the Evolutions from Jungle Set, and then some of the Fossil Set cards have also done really well. One notable one is the Gengar, going from $340 in a PSA 9, which I think was really underrated back in January of 2024, up to $622, and that makes a lot of sense given Gengar's popularity. Overall, the total prices for these PSA 9 cards was originally $3,865 going back to the beginning of the year, and now those have appreciated just a couple $100 up to $4,185. Switching over to the PSA 10s is a similar story to what we saw with the base set Big 3, where some of these cards haven't had a significant sale in recent times, and some of the cards have seen price increases and price decreases. One of the ones that saw an increase was the Dragonite card from Fossil Set, and this card moved from $3,619 up to $5,250, and I think that price point better represents the Chase card for Fossil Set, and the Dragonite is one of the most popular cards out there. Meanwhile, a few of these cards have dropped a little bit, Jolteon being one, Articuno being one, and even the Lapras has dropped just a little bit. The overall price for this portfolio of PSA 10s has gone from $34,955 to $36,016. A little bit of an increase there. Next, we'll move into the Rocket and Gym sets of the Wizard of the Coast era, and at least in PSA 9, every single one of these cards in the portfolio has increased in price since January of 2024, and many of these have been increasing still, even after January of 2025. Now, several of these cards have come close to doubling or even surpassed doubling of their prices, and some of the most notable ones are Sabrina's Gengar. Again, it's a Gengar on this list. Dark Dragonite, Dark Charizard. Even the Rocket's Mewtwo and the Blaine's Charizard have seen pretty significant price growth. And in fact, if we take all the cards in this portfolio measured from January of 2025, these cards went from $5,702 up to $6,782. That's a pretty significant jump. Now, flipping the script to the PSA 10s is a similar story, with many of these cards increasing in value since January of 2025. In fact, there's only been one card that hasn't had a sale in the last 3 months, and that's the Sabrina's Gengar, which I find fascinating because that was the highest performing PSA 9. So it'll be interesting to see how the next sale of Sabrina's Gengar does in a PSA 10. Now, one of the most notable cards on this list is the Dark Blastoise, which recently had an auction sale through Z&G Emporium for $5,200, and this is substantially higher than it was back in January of 2024 at about $1,200. So that's probably the biggest outlier on this list. Another one that's worth noting is the Blaine's Charizard, which has also increased from $3,300 up to $5,000, which again, pretty noticeable price appreciation there. Otherwise, the only card that dropped on this list is the Blaine's Moltres, which originally in January of 2024 was $3,850 and now is selling for $300 less. When we take all the prices, total them up, in January of 2025, this part of the portfolio represented $27,052 and now has climbed to $33,978. Moving into the Neo era is also pretty similar, with the PSA 9 prices appreciating almost across the board with a couple of exceptions, one being the lack of a PSA 9 sale for Houndoom from Neo Discovery, and then the Typhlosion number 17, one of the most difficult cards to grade, actually went down in PSA 9 from $1,344 to $1,318. Now, the most significant one that's worth talking about is the Lugia from Neo Genesis in PSA 9, which doesn't seem to sell almost ever. The only price that I could find on this recently was $5,000, and that's more than double of its price from January of 2024. Very significant price growth for that particular card. Of course, we also have the Espeon and the Umbreon from Neo Discovery on this list, with some pretty substantial price appreciation of their own. In total, this whole PSA 9 portfolio was originally $8,190 back at the beginning of the year and has appreciated up to $11,282, which is pretty significant for the PSA 9s. The PSA 10s, however, are a similar but slightly different story. A couple of these cards, like the Lugia and the Typhlosion 17, haven't had recent sales, and then a couple did have recent sales, like the Slowking and the Tyranitar from Neo Discovery, but those ones didn't have earlier sales to mark against, so I've excluded those from the data set. Now, one of the cards that has dropped substantially is the Pichu from Neo Genesis, which originally had a sale of about $16,000 and now had a recent sale of $12,500. Still a great sale for this card, but not nearly as high as that record high that we saw earlier in January. One of the cards that's done really well is the Espeon from Neo Discovery, and this one was originally selling for about $2,400 back in January of last year and is now sold for $4,162. And of course, we have to include the Umbreon. It's probably the favorite card people have from the Neo era, and this card is now selling for about $12,000. When we take the total for this entire portfolio, though, and match it up against earlier in the year, it's actually dropped. It originally was $76,403 and has now dropped to $76,162, which isn't a very significant decrease. We're not seeing that type of acceleration that we did with the PSA 9s. Next, we have another very impressive performance from the Neo cards from Neo Revelation and Neo Destiny. Now, as you'll notice, all the PSA 9s increased in value consistently since January of 2024. And a couple of the highlights here include the Dark Gengar, which has gone from $550, almost doubling in price up to $1,044. The Suicune is another one that more than doubled, and this one went from $414 up to $850. There's a few others on this list that have shown similarly impressive performance, but if we look at the overall totals, in January of 2025, these cards were selling collectively for $4,749 and have now increased to $6,143. Now, as we'll see with the PSA 10s, the performance since January of last year is still impressive, but we've seen that slowing down here once again with the PSA 10s. There's a few cards on this list that haven't had recent sales, including the Suicune and the Dark Espeon, which remained at $3,000. Then a couple of cards that had a recent sale but didn't have a sale historically to measure against, including the Entei and the Light Arcanine, which sold for $6,459. One of the cards that has gone down, though, was the Ho-Oh. We also saw the Raikou from Neo Revelation also decrease from $8,700 down to $7,000. Now, one of the more impressive ones, looking at January of 2024 to present, is the Light Dragonite, which has tripled in value, going from $1,000 to $2,000 and now to $3,000. So a little bit of consistency there for that card. Overall, we've seen these PSA 10 cards increase 2.4% over the last 3 months, which is nothing special, nothing to write home about, but the overall increase since January of 2024, which represents something of a low point for many of these vintage cards, has grown 69.46%. So again, large growth overall, definitely tapering off here in 2025, and maybe that's a sign of market dynamics to come. Finally, we'll take a look at one of the hottest areas of the market, and that's the Shining cards from both Neo Revelation as well as Neo Destiny. Now, in the PSA 9 prices, there's only one card that has dropped in price, and that's the Shining Kabutops of all cards, and pretty much every other one has shown significant price increases since last year in January. Now, one of these cards, the Shining Gyarados, which has almost doubled in value. We could look at the Shining Charizard, which is up to $5,628. Still not at its all-time high, but substantially better than where it was back in January of last year at under $4,000. One of my personal favorites on this list is the Shining Tyranitar, which has almost doubled in value as well, going from $1,075 up to $1,935. Overall, the PSA 9s have done really well, going from $15,651 at the beginning of this year up to $18,135 here in March. This is actually the only area of this portfolio that has outperformed in PSA 10 compared to PSA 9, but the Shining cards from PSA 10 have been on an absolute tear. The only one here that's retained its price value is the Shining Magikarp. The Shining Gyarados, though, knocks it out of the park, going from $6,100 back in January of last year and is now selling for upwards of $14,000 this year. A couple other notable ones that are worth discussing are the Shining Mewtwo. The Shining Mewtwo was originally $2,800 a little over a year ago and is now selling for over $5,000. Most recent auction came in at $5,800. Similarly, the Shining Tyranitar, another card that I absolutely love, went from $3,300 back in January of last year, dipped a little at the beginning of this year, and is now selling for $5,800. Overall, if we take a look at all these Shinings, going from $43,252 at the beginning of January, and are now selling for $53,016. That's almost a $10,000 increase. Interestingly, both sets of cards are doing extremely well, but we do see a deviation in how well they're performing with respect to just the last 3 months. Many of the PSA 9s are still increasing at a significant rate, where for many of the PSA 10 cards, they seem to be tapering off and in some cases establishing flat plateaus. And that begs the question, is this a top? It's always dangerous when you're buying at elevated prices, and if you had asked me a year ago if prices were undervalued, I probably would have said yes. And right now, I think people are buying in at a dangerous time, that many of these cards that have doubled in price over the course of 1 year, or in some cases even less than that, are taking on substantially more risk than you would be if you were buying when there was less eyes, less price growth, less action happening. And I think this all comes from the overall hype that we see in the market collectively. Modern is inaccessible right now. It's sold out online. It's scalped in person. And I think that's turning a lot of people to vintage and to other cards that they have the ability to acquire through auctions and through online services. So my word of warning would be careful. Whenever you see these massive price growths in a relatively short period of time, you have to ask yourself, is this authentic demand or is this hype? And that's a pretty quick appreciation for many of these cards. Having said that, I do think many of these prices had been traditionally undervalued. We'll probably see at least some level of price correction moving forward. That's my personal opinion. What I hope to see happen, though, is some stable linear growth, something that's more natural, more healthy, but that's just my opinion. I welcome all of your guys' thoughts down in the comments below. Let me know what you think of these data videos. I'm thinking about updating this spreadsheet every 3 months and doing a quarterly check-in on this vintage portfolio. Also, if you'd like me to check other portfolios of some other vintage cards or other eras of Pokemon, let me know, and that's something I'd love to put together because I really enjoy crunching the numbers. Anyway, guys, that's going to wrap it up for this one. I'm Pokemon Classics, reminding you all that the classics never go out of style. Stay well, everybody, and don't forget to have fun with collecting. That's really what this is all about. We'll see you with the next one. Bye, everybody.